Tranona, is Misha Rosemay Ivrian. Cir me Falta River, Gorge Gale foot and down, quick Enid Nave Bridge, Culturelon Náisiúnta Gael Canada, Ottawa, Príomhchathair Canada. Is mór ansásamh agus ómas stúing a bheith páirtíigh I léthiúireachta Domhnada Ulysses, sa bhliain 2013. Ba bhfuil an buíochas a gábháil le Hamasáid na Héireann agus le Sarah Thorenton ach go hairithe as uachta tacaíochtatha, agus ba bhfuil an buíochas a gábháil freisin leis an stúrthóir Stephen Dunne agus nóí leis na léthiúirí.
Good afternoon. I'm Sarah Thorenton, Consular and Cultural Officer at the Embassy of Ireland. A big welcome to our Irish family across the world. We're in Ottawa at St. Brigid's Centre for the Arts, home of the National Irish Canadian Cultural Centre. We're happy and delighted to be part of the worldwide reading of Ulysses this year in 2013. We have a great lineup of readers, including Fran Healy, Mary Wiggin, Gary McCrank, Wynn Quon, Niamh O'Brien. So without further ado, I pass you over to our readers for Circe and Eumaeus.
Private Compton, pulling his comrade. Here, bugger off, Harry, or Ben will have you in the lockup. Private car, staggeringly is pulled away. Good fuck, old Bennett, he's a wide-arse bugger, I don't give a shit for him. First watch, takes out his notebook. What's his name? Bloom. Peering over the crowd, I just see a car there. If you give me a hand a second, Sergeant. First watch. Name and address. Corny Keller whips around his hat, a dead wreath in his hand, appears among the bystanders. Bloom, quietly. Oh, the very man, he whispers. Simon Davila's son, a bit sprung. Get those policemen to move those loafers back. Night, Mr. Keller. Corny Keller. To the watch, with a drawling eye. That's all right, I know him. Won a bit on the races. Gold Cup. Throw away, he laughs. 20-1, do you follow me? First watch, turns to the crowd. Here, what are you all gaping at? Move on out of that. The crowd disperses slowly, muttering down the lane. Leave it to me, Sergeant. That'll be all right, he laughs, shaking his head. We were often as bad ourselves, aye, or worse. What, hey? What? First watch, laughs, I suppose so. Corny Keller, nudges the second watch. Come and wipe your name off the slate. He tilts, wagging his head. With a touraloom, touraloom, touraloom. But hey, do you follow me? Second watch, gently. Sure we were too. Corny Keller, winking. Boys will be boys. I've a car around there. Second watch. All right, Miss Keller. Good night. Corny Keller, I'll see to that. Bloom shakes hands with both of the watch and turn. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you, he mumbles confidently. We don't want any scandal, you understand. Father is well known, highly respected sitting. Just a little on the wild oats, you understand. First watch. Oh, I understand, sir. Second watch. That's all right, sir. First watch. I was only in case of corporal injury, so I'd have to report it at the station. Bloom nods rapidly. Naturally, quite right. Only on Bowden duty. Second watch. It's our duty. Corny Keller. Good night, men. The watch, saluting together. Night, gentlemen. They move off with slow, heavy tread. Bloom blows. Provincially, you came on the scene, you have a car. Corny Keller laughs, pointing his thumb over his right shoulder to the car brought up against the scaffolding. Two commercials that were standing fizz at Gemmett's. Little Princess, Fate. One of them lost £2 on their race, drowning his grief, and we're on for a go with the Jolly Girls. So I landed them up on Bean's car and down to Nighttown. Bloom. I was just going home by Gardner Street when I happened to. Corny Keller laughs. Sure, they want me to join in with the mots? No, by God, says I. Not for old stages like myself and yourself. He laughs again and leers with a lacklustre eye. Thanks be to God we have it in the house. What? Hey? Do you follow me? Ha ha ha. Bloom tries to laugh. He. Yes, matter of fact, I was just visiting an old friend of mine there. Figure, you don't know him, poor fellow, he's laid up for the past week. We had a liquor together, and I was just making my way home. The horse neighs, the horse. Ho, 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 home. Corny Keller. Sure, it was Bean or Jarvie there. They told me after we left the two commercials in Mrs. Cohen's, and I told him to pull up and got off to sea. He laughs. Sober horse drivers especially. I'll give you a lift home. Where does he hang out? Somewhere in Cabra? What? Bloom. No, in Sandy Cove, I believe, from what he let drop. Stephen, prone, breathes into the stars. Corny Keller acquaintances drawls to the horse. Bloom and gloom, loom down. Corny Keller scratches his nape. Sandy Cove. He bends down and calls to Stephen. Hey! He calls again. Hey! He's covered with shavings, anyhow. Take care they don't lift anything off him. Bloom. No, 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 I have his money and his hat here and stick. Corny Heller. Oh well, he'll get over it, no bones broken. Well, I'll shove along. He laughs. I've a rendezvous in the morning, burying the dead, safe home. The horse neighs. Ho, ho, home. Bloom. Good night, I'll just wait and take him along in a few. Corny Heller returns to the outside car and mounts it. The horse harness jingles. Corny Heller. From the car standing. Night. Bloom. Night. Jarvie chucks the reins and raises his whip encouragingly. The car and horse back slowly, awkwardly and torn. Corny Heller on the side step sways his head to and fro in sigh of mirth at Bloom's plight. The Jarvie joins in the mute pantomimic merriment, nodding from the farther seat. Bloom shakes his head in mute mirthful reply. With thumb and palm, Corny Heller reassures the two bobbies will follow the sleep to continue for what is said to be done. What a slow nod Bloom conveys his gratitude at what is actually what Stephen needs. The car jingles Touraloom around the course of the Touraloom lane. Corny Heller again reassuralooms with his hand. Bloom with his hand assuralooms Corny Heller that he is a reassuralum stay. The tinkling hoofs from the jingling harness grows fainter, and with the Touraloo lay Bloom holding in his hand Stephen's hat, bassoons with shavings and ashpans, stands irritably that he bends to him and shakes him by the shoulder. Bloom. Hey ho, there is no answer. He bends again. Mr. Daedalus, there is no answer. The name he calls, Sombalombalulus. He bends again and hesitates, brings his mouth near to the face of the prostrate form. Stephen, there is no answer. He calls again. Stephen. Stephen groans. Who? Black Panther vampire. He sighs and stretches himself, then murmurs thickly with prolonged vowels. Who? Drive. Fergus now. And Pierce, wood-woven shade. He turns to his left side, sighing, doubling themselves together. Bloom. Poetry, well educated, pity. He bends again and undoes the buttons of Stephen's waistcoat. To Brigid, he brushes the wood shavings from Stephen's clothes with light hands and fingers. £1.7, not hurt anyhow. He listens. What? Stephen murmurs, shadows the woods, white breast dim. He stretched out his arms, sighs again and curls his body. Bloom holding his hat, an ash plant stands erect. A dog barks in the distance. Bloom tightens and loosens his grip on the ash plant. He looks down at Stephen's face and form. Bloom communicates with the night. Face reminds me of his poor mother in the shady wood, the deep white breast. Ferguson, I think I caught. A girl, some girl. Best thing could happen, he murmurs. Swears that I will always hail, never ever conceal, never reveal any part or parts, art or arts, he murmurs. In the rough sands of the sea, a cable tows length from the shore where the tide ebbs and flows. Silence, thoughtful, alert, he stands on guard, his fingers on his lips in the attitude of a secret master. Against the dark wall, a figure appears slowly. A fairy boy of 11, a changeling, kidnapped, dressed in the Eton suit with glass shoes and a little bronze helmet, holding a book in his hand. He reads from right to left inaudibly, smiling, kissing the page. Bloom. Rudy, gazing on the scene into Bloom's eyes and goes on reading, kissing, smiling. He has a delicate mauve face. On his suit he has diamonds and ruby buttons. In his free left hand he holds a slim ivory cane with a violet bow knot. A white lambskin peeps out of his waistcoat pocket.
"1 a.m. They made a beeline across the back of the custom house and passed under the Loop Line Bridge. Preparatory to anything else, Mr. Bloom brushed off the greater bulk of the shavings and handed Stephen the hat and ash plant and bucked him up generally in orthodox Samaritan fashion, which he very badly needed. His, Stephen's, mind was not exactly what you would call wandering, but a bit unsteady, and on his expressed desire for some beverage to drink, Mr. Bloom, in view of the hour it was and there being no pumps of artery water available for their ablutions, let alone drinking purposes, hit upon an expedient by suggesting off the reel the propriety of the cabman's shelter, as it was called, hardly a stone's throw away near Butt Bridge, where they might hit upon some drinkables in the shape of a milk and soda or a mineral. But how to get there was the rub. For the nonce, he was rather nonplussed, but inasmuch as the duty plainly devolved upon him to take some measures on the subject, he pondered suitable ways and means, during which Stephen repeatedly yawned. So far as he could see, he was rather pale in the face, so that it occurred to him as highly advisable to get a conveyance of some description, which would answer in their then condition, both of them being ED, particularly Stephen, always assuming that there was such a thing to be found. Accordingly, after a few such preliminaries as, in spite of his having forgotten to take up his rather soap-suddy handkerchief after it had done yeoman's service in the shaving line, brushing, they both walked together along Beaver Street, or more properly Lane, as far as the farrier's and the distinctly fetid atmosphere of the livery stables at the corner of Montgomery Street, where they made tracks to the left, from thence debouching into Amiens Street, round by the corner of Dan Bergen's. But, as he confidently anticipated, there was not a sign of a Jehu plying for hire anywhere to be seen, except a four-wheeler, probably engaged by some fellows inside on the spree, outside the North Star Hotel, and there was no symptom of its budging a quarter of an inch when Mr. Bloom, who was anything but a professional whistler, endeavored to hail it by emitting a kind of a whistle, holding his arms arched over his head twice. This was a quandary, but bringing common sense to bear on it, evidently there was nothing for it but put a good face on the matter and foot it, which they accordingly did. So, beveling around by Mullet's and the Signal House, which they shortly reached, they proceeded perforce in the direction of Amiens Street railway terminus, Mr. Bloom being handicapped by the circumstance that one of the back buttons of his trousers had, to vary the time-honored adage, gone the way of all buttons, though entering thoroughly into the spirit of the thing, he heroically made light of the mischance. So as neither of them were particularly pressed for time, as it happened, and the temperature refreshing since it cleared up after the recent visitation of Jupiter Pluvius, they dandered along past by where the empty vehicle was waiting without a fare or a jarvey. As it so happened, a Dublin United Tramways Company's sandstrewer happening to be returning, and the elder man recounted to his companion, apropos of the incident, his own truly miraculous escape of some little while back. They passed the main entrance of the Great Northern Railway Station, the starting point for Belfast, where of course all traffic was suspended at that late hour, and passing the back door of the morgue, a not very enticing locality, not to say gruesome to a degree, more especially at night, ultimately gained the Dock Tavern and in due course turned into Store Street, famous for its C Division police station. Between this point and the high, at present unlit warehouses of Beresford Place, Stephen thought to think of Ibsen, associated with Baird's The Stonecutters in his mind somehow in Talbot Place, first turning on the right, while the other, who was acting as his Fetus Acatus, inhaled with internal satisfaction the smell of James Rourke's City Bakery, situated quite close to where they were, the very palatable odor, indeed, of our daily bread, of all commodities of the public, the primary and most indispensable. Bread, the staff of life, earn your bread, oh, tell me where is fancy bread, at Rourke's, the baker's, it is said. En route to his taciturn, and not to put too fine a point on it, not yet perfectly sober companion, Mr. Bloom, who at all events was in complete possession of his faculties, never more so, in fact, disgustingly sober, spoke a word of caution re the dangers of night town, women of ill fame, and swell mobsmen, which barely permissible once in a while, though not as a habitual practice, was of the nature of a regular death trap for young fellows of his age, particularly if they had acquired drinking habits under the influence of liquor, unless you knew a little jujitsu for every contingency, as even a fellow on the broad of his back could administer a nasty kick if you didn't look out. Highly providential was the appearance on the scene of Corny Kelleher when Stephen was blissfully unconscious that but for that man in the gap turning up at the 11th hour, the feeney might have been that he might have been a candidate for the accident ward, or failing that, the bridewell, and an appearance in the court next day before Mr. Tobias, or he being the solicitor, rather old Wall, he meant to say, or Mahoney, which simply spelt ruin for a chap when it got bruited about. The reason he mentioned the fact was that a lot of those policemen whom he cordially disliked were admittedly unscrupulous in the service of the Crown, and as Mr. Bloom put it, recalling a case or two in the A Division in Clanbrassil Street, prepared to swear a hole through a 10-gallon pot. Never on the spot when wanted, but in quiet parts of the city, Pembroke Road, for example, the guardians of the law were well in evidence, the obvious reason being they were paid to protect the upper classes. Another thing he commented on was equipping soldiers with firearms or sidearms of any description liable to go off at any time, which was tantamount to inciting them against civilians should by any chance they fall out over anything. You frittered away your time, he very sensibly maintained, and the health and also character, besides which the squandermania of the thing, fast women of the demi-monde ran away with a lot of pounds, shillings, pence into the bargain, and the greatest danger of all was who you got drunk with, though touching the much vexed question of stimulants, he relished a glass of choice old wine in season as both nourishing and blood-making and possessing aperient virtues, notably a good Burgundy, which he was a staunch believer in, still never beyond a certain point where he invariably drew the line, as it simply led to trouble all round, to say nothing of your being at the tender mercy of others practically. Most of all, he commented adversely on the desertion of Stephen by all his pub-hunting confrères but one, a most glaring piece of ratting on the part of his brother medicos under all the circs. And that one was Judas, said Stephen, who up to then had said nothing whatsoever of any kind. Discussing these and kindred topics, they made a beeline across the back of the custom house and passed under the loop line bridge, where a brazier of coke burning in front of a sentry box, or something like one, attracted their rather lagging footsteps. Stephen, of his own accord, stopped for no special reason to look at the heap of barren cobblestones, and by the light emanating from the brazier, he could just make out the darker figure of the corporation watchman inside the gloom of the sentry box. He began to remember that this had happened or had been mentioned as having happened before, but it cost him no small effort before he remembered that he recognized in the sentry a quondam friend of his father's, Gumley. To avoid a meeting, he drew nearer to the pillars of the railway bridge. "Someone saluted you," Mr. Bloom said. A figure of middle height on the prowl, evidently under the arches, saluted again, calling, "Night!" Stephen, of course, started rather dizzily and stopped to return the compliment. Mr. Bloom, actuated by motives of inherent delicacy, inasmuch as he always believed in minding his own business, moved off, but nevertheless remained on the qui-vive, with just a shade of anxiety, though not funkyish in the least. Though unusual in the Dublin area, he knew that it was not by any means unknown for desperadoes who had next to nothing to live on to be about waylaying and generally terrorizing peaceable pedestrians by placing a pistol at their head in some secluded spot outside the city proper. Famished loiterers of the Thames embankment category, they might be hanging about there, or simply marauders ready to decamp with whatever boodle they could in one false swoop, at a moment's notice, your money or your life, leaving you there to point a moral, gagged and garroted. Stephen, that is when the accosting figure came to close quarters, though he was not in any over-sober state himself, recognized Corley's breath, redolent of rotten corn juice. Lord John Corley, some called him, and his genealogy came about in this wise. He was the eldest son of Inspector Corley of the G Division, lately deceased, who had married a certain Catherine Brophy, the daughter of a Louth farmer. His grandfather, Patrick Michael Corley, of New Ross, had married the widow of a publican there, whose maiden name had been Catherine, also Talbot. Rumour had it, though not proved, that she descended from the house of the Lords Talbot de Malahide, in whose mansion, really an unquestionably fine residence of its kind and well worth seeing, her mother or aunt or some relative had enjoyed the distinction of being in service in the wash kitchen. This, therefore, was the reason why the still comparatively young, though dissolute man who now addressed Stephen was spoken of by some with facetious proclivities as Lord John Corley.
Taking Stephen on one side, he had the customary doleful ditty to tell. Not as much as a farthing to purchase a night's lodging. His friends had all deserted him. Furthermore, he had a row with Lenihan and called him to Stephen a mean, bloody swab with a sprinkling of other uncalled-for expressions. He was out of a job and implored of Stephen to tell him where on God's earth he could get something, anything at all to do. No, it was the daughter of the mother in the wash kitchen that was the foster sister to the heir of the house, or else they were connected through the mother in some way, both occurrences happening at the same time, if the whole thing wasn't a complete fabrication from start to finish. Anyhow, he was all in. I wouldn't ask you only, pursued he, on my solemn oath. God knows I'm on the rocks. There'll be a job tomorrow or next day, Stephen told him, in a boys' school at Dalkey, for a gentleman usher. Mr. Garrett Deasy. Try it. You may mention my name. Oh, God, Corley replied. Sure I couldn't teach in a school, man. I was never one of your bright ones, he added with a half-laugh. Got stuck twice in the juniors in the Christian Brothers. I've no place to sleep myself, Stephen informed him. Corley, at the first go-off, was inclined to suspect it was something to do with Stephen being fired out of his digs for bringing in a bloody tart off the street. There was a doss house in Marlborough Street, Mrs. Maloney's, but it was only a tanner touch and full of undesirables. But McCrank told him you got a decent enough do in the Brazen Head over in Wine Tavern Street, which was distantly suggestive to the person addressed of Friar Bacon, for a bob. He was starving too, though he hadn't said a word about it. This sort of thing went on every other night, or very near it. Still, Stephen's feelings got the better of him in a sense, though he knew that Corley's brand-new rigmarole, on a par with the others, was hardly deserving of much credence. However, Haud ignoris malorum miseris succurrere disco, etc., as the Latin poet remarks, especially, as luck would have it, he got paid his screw after every middle of the month on the 16th, which was the date of the month as a matter of fact, though a good bit of the wherewithal was demolished. But the cream of the joke was nothing would get it out of Corley's head that he was living in affluence and hadn't a thing to do but hand out the needful. Whereas he put his hand in a pocket anyhow, not with the idea of finding any food there, but thinking he might lend him anything up to a bob or so in lieu, so that he might endeavour at all events to get sufficient to eat. But the result was in the negative, for to his chagrin he found his cash missing. A few broken biscuits were all the result of his investigation. He tried his hardest to recollect for the moment whether he had lost, as well he might have, or left, because in that contingency it was not a pleasant lookout, very much the reverse, in fact. He was altogether too fagged out to institute a thorough search, though he tried to recollect about biscuits he dimly remembered. Who now exactly gave them, or where was or did he buy? However, in another pocket he came across what he surmised in the dark were pennies, erroneously, however, as it turned out. Those are half-crowns, man, Corley corrected him. And so, in point of fact, they turned out to be. Stephen lent him one of them. Thanks, Corley answered. You're a gentleman. I'll pay you back sometime. Who's that with you? I saw him a few times in the Bleeding Horse in Camden Street with Boyle and the bill sticker. You might put in a good word for us to get me taken on there. I'd carry a sandwich board. Only the girl in the office told me they're full up for the next 3 weeks, man. God, you've to book ahead, man. You'd think it was for the Carl Rosa. I don't give a shite anyway, so long as I get a job, even as a crossing sweeper. Subsequently, being not quite so down in the mouth after the 2 and 6 he got, he informed Stephen about a fellow named of Baggs Comiskey that he said Stephen knew well out of Fulham's, the ship chandler's, bookkeeper there, that used to be often round at Nagel's, back with O'Mara, and a little chap with a stutter named of Ty. Anyhow, he was lagged the night before last and fined 10 bob for a drunken disorderly and refusing to go with the constable. Mr. Bloom, in the meanwhile, kept dodging about in the vicinity of the cobblestones near the brazier of coke in front of the corporation watchman's sentry box, who, evidently a glutton for work, it struck him, was having a quiet 40 winks for all intents and purposes on his own private account while Dublin slept. He threw an odd eye at the same time now and then at Stephen's anything but immaculately attired interlocutor, as if he had seen that nobleman somewhere or other, though where he was not in a position to truthfully state, nor had he the remotest idea when. Being a level-headed individual who could give points to not a few in point of shrewd observation, he also remarked on his very dilapidated hat and slouching wearing apparel generally, testifying to a chronic impecuniosity. Probably he was one of his hangers-on, but for the matter of that, it was merely a question of one preying on his next-door neighbour all round, in every deep, so to put it, a deeper depth. And for that matter, if the man in the street chanced to be in the dock himself, penal servitude, with or without option of fine, would be a very rare avis altogether. In any case, he had a consummate amount of cool assurance intercepting people at that hour of the night or morning. Pretty thick, that was, certainly. The pair parted company, and Stephen rejoined Mr. Bloom, who, with his practised eye, was not without perceiving that he had succumbed to the blandiloquence of the other parasite. Alluding to the encounter, he said laughingly, Stephen, that is, he's down on his luck. He asked me to ask you to ask somebody named Boylan, a bill sticker, to give him a job as a sandwich man. At this intelligence, in which he seemingly evinced little interest, Mr. Bloom gazed abstractedly for the space of a half-second or so in the direction of a bucket dredger, rejoicing in the far-famed name of Iblana, moored alongside Custom House Quay and quite possibly out of repair, whereupon he observed evasively, Everybody gets their own ration of luck, they say. Now you mention it, his face was familiar to me, but leaving that for the moment, how much did you part with, he queried, if I'm not too inquisitive. 1/2 crown, Stephen responded. I dare say he needs to sleep somewhere. Needs, Mr. Bloom ejaculated, professing not the least surprise at the intelligence. I can quite credit the assertion, and I guarantee he invariably does. Everyone according to his needs, or everyone according to his deeds. But talking about things in general, where, he added with a smile, will you sleep yourself? Walking to Sandy Cove is out of the question, and even supposing you did, you wouldn't get in after what happened at Westland Row Station. Simply fag out there for nothing. I don't mean to presume to dictate to you in the slightest degree, but why did you leave your father's house? To seek misfortune, was Stephen's answer. I met your respected father on a recent occasion, Mr. Bloom diplomatically returned. Today, in fact, or to be strictly accurate, on yesterday. Where does he live at present? I gathered in the course of conversation that he'd moved. I believe he is in Dublin somewhere, Stephen answered unconcernedly. Why? A gifted man, Mr. Bloom said of Mr. Dedalus Sr., in more respects than one, and a born raconteur, if ever there was one. He takes great pride, quite legitimately, out of you. You could go back, perhaps, he hazarded, still thinking of the very unpleasant scene at Westland Road terminus, when it was perfectly evident that the other two, Mulligan, that is, and that English tourist friend of his, who eventually euchred their third companion, were patently trying, as if the whole Bally station belonged to them, to give Stephen the slip in the confusion. There was no response forthcoming to the suggestion, however, such as it was, Stephen's mind's eye being too busily engaged in repicturing his family hearth the last time he saw it, with his sister Dilly sitting by the ingle, her hair hanging down, waiting for some weak Trinidad shell cocoa that was in the soot-coated kettle to be done, so that she and he could drink it with oatmeal water for milk after the Friday herrings they had eaten at 2 a penny, with an egg apiece for Maggie, Booty, and Katy, the cat, meanwhile, under the mangle, devouring a mess of eggshells and charred fish heads and bones on a square of brown paper, in accordance with the 3rd precept of the Church, to fast and abstain on the days commanded, it being quarter tense or, if not, ember days or something like that. No, Mr. Bloom repeated again, I wouldn't personally repose much trust in that boon companion of yours, who contributes the humorous element, Dr. Mulligan, as a guide, philosopher, and friend if I were in your shoes. He knows which side his bread is buttered on, though in all probability he never realized what it is to be without regular meals. Of course, you didn't notice as much as I did, but it wouldn't occasion me the least surprise to learn that a pinch of tobacco or some narcotic was put in your drink for some ulterior object. He understood, however, from all he heard, that Dr. Mulligan was a versatile, all-round man, by no means confined to medicine only, who was rapidly coming to the fore in his line, and if the report was verified, bade fair to enjoy a flourishing practice in the not-distant future as a Tony medical practitioner, drawing a handsome fee for his services, in addition to which professional status, his rescue of that man from certain drowning by artificial respiration and what they call first aid at Scaries, or Malahide was, he was bound to admit, an exceedingly plucky deed which he could not too highly praise, so that, frankly, he was utterly at a loss to fathom what earthly reason could be at the back of it, except he put it down to sheer cussedness or jealousy, pure and simple. Except it simply amounts to one thing, and he is what they call picking your brains, he ventured to throw out. The guarded glance of half solicitude, half curiosity, augmented by friendliness, which he gave that Stephen's at present morose expression of features, did not throw a flood of light, none at all, in fact, on the problem as to whether or not he had let himself be badly bamboozled, to judge by 2 or 3 low-spirited remarks he let drop, or, on the other way about, saw through the affair, and for some reason or other best known to himself, allowed matters to more or less. Grinding poverty did have that effect, any more than conjectured that, high educational abilities though he possessed, he experienced no little difficulty in making both ends meet. Adjacent to the men's public urinal, he perceived an ice cream car, round which a group of presumably Italians in heated altercation were getting rid of voluble expressions in their vivacious language in a particularly animated way, there being some little differences between the parties. Puttana Madonna, che ci di I quattrini! Ho ragione! Culo rotto! Intendiamoci! Mezzo sovrano più! Dice lui però, farabutto, mortacci sui! Mr. Bloom and Stephen entered the cabman's shelter, an unpretentious wooden structure where, prior to then, he had rarely, if ever, been before, the former having previously whispered to the latter a few hints anent the keeper of it, said to be the once famous Skin-the-Goat Fitzharris, the Invincible, though he wouldn't vouch for the actual facts, which quite possibly there was not one vestige of truth in. A few moments later saw our 2 noctambules safely seated in a discreet corner, only to be greeted by stares from the decidedly miscellaneous collection of waifs and strays and other nondescript specimens of the genus Homo, already there engaged in eating and drinking, diversified by conversation, for whom they seemingly formed an object of marked curiosity.
Now, touching a cup of coffee, Mr. Bloom ventured to plausibly suggest to break the ice. It occurs to me you ought to sample something in the shape of solid food, say a roll of some description. Accordingly, his first act was with characteristic sang-froid to order these commodities quietly. The hoi polloi of Jarvies or Stevedores or whatever they were, after a cursory examination, turned their eyes, apparently dissatisfied, away, though one red-bearded, bibulous individual, portion of whose hair was greyish, a sailor, probably, still stared for some appreciable time before transferring his rapt attention to the floor. Mr. Bloom, availing himself of the right of free speech, he having just a bowing acquaintance with the language in dispute, though, to be sure, rather in a quandary over voglio, remarked to his protege in an audible tone of voice, apropos of the battle royal in the street, which was still raging fast and furious. A beautiful language, I mean for singing purposes. Why do you not write your poetry in that language? Bella poetria. It is so melodious and full. Bella donna. Voglio. Stephen, who was trying his dead best to yawn if he could, suffering from dead lassitude generally, replied, "To fill the ear of a cow elephant. They were haggling over money." "Is that so?" Mr. Bloom asked. Of course, he subjoined pensively, at the inward reflection of there being more languages to start with than were absolutely necessary, "It may be only the southern glamour that surrounds it." The keeper of the shelter, in the middle of this tete-a-tete, put a boiling swimming cup of a choice concoction labeled coffee on the table, and the rather antediluvian specimen of a bun, or so it seemed, after which he beat a retreat to his counter. Mr. Bloom, determined to have a good square look at him later on, so as not to appear to, for which reason he encouraged Stephen to proceed with his eyes, which he did by the honours of surreptitiously pushing the cup of what was temporarily supposed to be called coffee gradually nearer him. Sounds are impostures, Stephen said after a pause of some little time, like names. Cicero, Podmore, Napoleon, Mr. Goodbody, Jesus, Mr. Doyle. Shakespeare's were as common as Murphy's. What's in a name? Yes, to be sure, Mr. Bloom unaffectively concurred. Of course, our name was changed too, he added, pushing the so-called roll across. The red-bearded sailor, who had his weather eye on the newcomers, boarded Stephen, whom he had singled out for attention in particular, squarely by asking, "And what might your name be?" Just in the nick of time, Mr. Bloom touched his companion's boot, but Stephen, apparently disregarding the warm pressure from an unexpected quarter, answered, "Daedalus." The sailor stared at him heavily from a pair of drowsy, baggy eyes, rather bunged up from excessive use of booze, preferably good old Hollands and water. "You know Simon Daedalus?" he asked at length. "I've heard of him," Stephen said. Mr. Bloom was all at sea for a moment, seeing the others evidently eavesdropping too. "He's Irish," the seaman bold affirmed, staring still in much the same way and nodding. "All Irish." "All too Irish," Stephen rejoined. As for Mr. Bloom, he could neither make head or tail of the whole business, and he was just asking himself what possible connection, when the sailor of his own accord turned to the other occupants of the shelter with the remark, "I seen him shoot 2 eggs off 2 bottles at 50 yards over his shoulder, the left hand dead shot," though he was slightly hampered by an occasional stammer, and his gestures being also clumsy, as was still he did his best to explain. "Bottles out there, say, 50 yards measured, eggs on the bottles, cocks his gun over his shoulder, aims." He turned his body half round, shut up his eye completely, then he screwed his features up some way sideways and glared out into the night with an unprepossessing cast of countenance. "Pum!" he then shouted once. The entire audience waited, anticipating an additional detonation, there being still a further egg. "Pum!" he shouted twice. Egg 2 evidently demolished, he nodded and winked, adding bloodthirstily, "Buffalo Bill shoots to kill, never missed, nor he never will." A silence ensued till Mr. Bloom, for agreeableness' sake, just felt like asking him whether it was for a marksmanship competition like the Bisley. "Beg pardon," the sailor said. "Long ago," Mr. Bloom pursued, without flinching a hair's breadth. "Why," the sailor replied, relaxing to a certain extent under the magic influence of diamond cut diamond, "it might be a matter of 10 years. He toured the wide world with Hengler's Royal Circus. I seen him do that in Stockholm." "Curious coincidence," Mr. Bloom confided to Stephen unobtrusively. "Murphy's my name," the sailor continued. "W.B. Murphy, of Carrigaloe. Know where that is?" "Queenstown Harbour," Stephen replied. "That's right," the sailor said. "Fort Camden and Fort Carlisle, that's where I hails from. My little woman's down there. She's waiting for me, I know, for England, home and beauty. She's my own true wife, I haven't seen for 7 years now, sailing about." Mr. Bloom could easily picture his advent on this scene, the homecoming to the mariner's roadside shieling after having diddled Davy Jones, a rainy night with a blind moon, across the world for a wife. Quite a number of stories there were on that particular Alice Ben Bowl topic, Enoch Arden and Rip Van Winkle, and does anybody hereabouts remember Cake O'Leary, a favourite and most trying declamation piece, by the way, of poor John Casey, and a bit of perfect poetry in its own small way. Never about the runaway wife coming back, however much devoted to the absentee. The face at the window. Judge of his astonishment when he finally did breast the tape, and the awful truth dawned upon him anent his better half, wrecked in his affections. "You little expected me, but I've come to stay and make a fresh start." There she sits, a grass widow, at the self-same fireside, believes me dead, rocked in the cradle of the deep. And there sits Uncle Chubb, or Tompkin, as the case might be, the publican of the Crown and Anchor, in shirt sleeves, eating rump steak and onions. No chair for the father. Boo, the wind. Her brand new arrival is on her knee, post-mortem child, with a high row and a randy row, and my galloping Terry Tandio. Bow to the inevitable, grin and bear it. I remain, with much love, your broken-hearted husband, W.B. Murphy. The sailor, who scarcely seemed to be a Dublin resident, turned to one of the Jarvies with the request, "You don't happen to have such a thing as a spare chaw about you, do you?" The Jarvie addressed, as it happened, had not, but the keeper took a die of plug from his good jacket hanging on a nail, and the desired object was passed from hand to hand. "Thank you," the sailor said. He deposited the quid in his gob, and chewing with some slow stammers proceeded. "We come up this morning 11 o'clock. The three-master Rosemay from Bridgewater with bricks. I shipped to get over, paid off this afternoon. There's my discharge, see? W.B. Murphy, ABS. In confirmation of which statement, he extricated from an inside pocket and handed to his neighbour a not very clean-looking folded document. "You must have seen a fair share of the world," the keeper remarked, leaning on the counter. "Why," the sailor answered upon reflection upon it, "I've circumnavigated a bit since I first joined on. I was in the Red Sea. I was in China and North America and South America. I seen icebergs plenty, growlers. I was in Stockholm and the Black Sea, the Dardanelles under Captain Dalton, the best bloody man that ever scuttled a ship. I seen Russia, Gospodi Pomeloy, that's how the Russians praise." "You seen queer sights, don't be talking," put in a Jarvey. "Why," the sailor said, shifting his partially chewed plug, "I seen queer things too, ups and downs. I seen a crocodile bite the fluke of an anchor, same as I chew that quid." He took out of his mouth the pulpy quid, and lodging it between his teeth, bit ferociously. "Con, like that. And I seen man-eaters in Peru that eats corpses and the livers of horses. Look here they are. A friend of mine sent me." He fumbled out a picture postcard from his inside pocket, which seemed to be in its way a species of repository, and pushed it along the table. The printed matter on it stated, "Goza de Indios, Bene Bolivia." All focused their attention on the scene exhibited, a group of savage women in striped loincloths, squatted, blinking, suckling, frowning, sleeping, amid a swarm of infants, there must have been quite a score of them, outside some primitive shanties of osier. "Chews cocoa all day long," the communicative tarpaulin added. "Stomachs like bread graters. Cuts off their ditties when they can't bear no more children. See them sitting there, stark ballock naked, eating a dead horse's liver raw." His postcard proved a centre of attraction for Messrs. the Greenhorns for several minutes, if not more. "Know how to keep them off?" he inquired genially. Nobody volunteering a statement, he winked, saying, "Glass, that boggles them. Glass." Mr. Bloom, without evincing surprise, unostentatiously turned over the card to peruse the partially obliterated address and postmark. It ran as follows: Tarjeta Postal, Señor A. Boudin, Galeria Beque, Santiago, Chile. There was no message, evidently, as he took particular notice. Though not an implicit believer in the lurid story narrated, or the egg-sniping transaction for that matter, despite William Tell and the Lazarillo Don Cesar de Bazan incident depicted in Maritana, on which occasion the former's ball passed through the latter's hat, having detected a discrepancy between his name, assuming he was the person he represented himself to be, and not sailing under false colours after having boxed the compass on the strict QT somewhere, and the fictitious addressee of the missive which made him nourish some suspicions of our friend's bona fides. Nevertheless, it reminded him in a way of a long-cherished plan he meant to one day realize some Wednesday or Saturday, of travelling to London via long sea. Not to say that he had ever travelled extensively to any great extent, but he was at heart a born adventurer, though by a trick of fate he had consistently remained a landlubber, except to call going to Holyhead, which was his longest. Martin Cunningham frequently said he would work a pass through Egan, but some deuced hitch or other eternally cropped up, with the net result that the scheme fell through. But even suppose it did come to planking down the needful and breaking Boyd's heart, it was not so dear, purse permitting. A few guineas at the outside, considering the fare to Mullingar, where he figured on going, was 5 and 6 there and back. The trip would benefit health on account of the bracing ozone, and be in every way thoroughly pleasurable, especially for a chap whose liver was out of order, seeing the different places along the route, Plymouth, Falmouth, Southampton, and so on, culminating in an instructive tour of the sights of the great metropolis, the spectacle of our modern Babylon, where doubtless he would see the greatest improvement, Tower, Abbey, wealth of Park Lane to renew acquaintance with. Another thing that just struck him as a by no means bad notion was he might have a gaze around on the spot to see about trying to make arrangements about a concert tour of summer music, embracing the most prominent pleasure resorts, Margate with mixed bathing and first-rate hydros and spas, Eastbourne, Scarborough, Margate and so on, beautiful Bournemouth, the Channel Islands and similar bijou spots, which might prove highly remunerative. Not, of course, with a hole-in-the-corner scratch company or local ladies on the job, witness Mrs. CPM McCoy type, lend me your valise and I'll post you the ticket. No, something more top-notch, an all-star Irish cast, the Tweedy Flower Grand Opera Company, with his own legal consort as leading lady as a sort of counterblast to the Elster Grimes and Moody Manners, perfectly simple matter, and he was quite sanguine of success, providing puffs in the local paper could be managed by some fellow with a bit of bounce who could pull the indispensable wires, and thus combine business with pleasure. But who? That was the rub.
Also, without being actually positive, it struck him a great field was to be opened up in the line of opening up new routes, to keep pace with the times apropos of the Fishgar-Rosslare route, which was once more on the tapis of circumlocution departments, with the usual quantity of red tape and dilly-dallying of effete foggydom and dudderheads generally. A great opportunity there certainly was for push and enterprise to meet the traveling needs of the public at large, the average man, i.e. Brown, Robinson, and Co. It was a subject of regret and absurd, as well on the face of it, and no small blame to our vaunted society that the man in the street, when the system really needed toning up, for the matter of a couple of paltry pounds, was debarred from seeing more of the world they lived in, instead of being always cooped up since my old stick in the mud took me for a wife. After all, hang it, they had their 11 or more humdrum months of it and merited a radical change of venue, after the grind of city life in the summertime, for a choice when Dame Nature is at her spectacular best, constituting nothing short of a new lease of life. There were equally excellent opportunities for vacationists in the home island, delightful sylvan spots for rejuvenation, offering a plethora of attractions, as well as a bracing tonic for the system in and around Dublin and its picturesque environs. Even Poulavuka, to which there was a steam tram, but also farther away from the madding crowd, in Wicklow, rightly termed the Garden of Ireland, an ideal neighborhood for elderly wheelmen, so long as it didn't come down. And in the wilds of Donegal, where, if report spoke true, the coup d'oil was exceedingly grand, though the last named locality was not easily gettable, so that the influx in visitors was not as yet all that it might be, considering the signal benefits to be derived from. While Howth, with his historic associations, and otherwise Silken Thomas, Grace O'Malley, George IV, Rond and drawn several hundred feet above sea level, was a favorite haunt with all sorts and conditions of men, especially in the spring, when a young man's fancy, though it had its own toll of deaths by falling off cliffs by design, or accidentally, usually, by the way of their left leg, it being only about three-quarters of an hour's run from the pillar, because, of course, up-to-date tourist traveling was as yet merely in its infancy, so to speak, and the accommodation left much to be desired. Interesting to fathom, it seemed to him, from a motive of curiosity, pure and simple, was whether it was the traffic that created the route, or vice versa, or two sides in the fact. He turned back the other side of the card picture and passed it along to Stephen. "I seen a Chinese one time," related a doughty narrator, "that had little pills like putty, and he put them in the water. And when they opened, in every pill was something different. One was a ship, another was a house, another was a flower. Cooked rats in your soup," he appetizingly added, "the Chinese does." Possibly perceiving an expression of dubiosity on their faces, the globetrotter went on adhering to his adventures. "And I seen a man killed in Troyes by an Italian chap. Knife in his back, knife like that." While speaking, he produced a dangerous-looking clasp knife, quite in keeping with his character, and held it in a striking position. In a knocking shop, it was account of a try-on between two smugglers. Fella hid behind a door, come up behind him like that. "Prepare to meet your God," says he. Chook! It went into his back, up to the butt. His heavy glance, drowsily roaming about, kind of defied their further questions, even should there by any chance want to. "That's a good bit of steel," repeated he, examining his formidable stiletto. After which harrowing denouement, sufficient to appall the stoutest, he snapped the blade to and stowed the weapon in question away as before in his chamber of horrors, otherwise pocket. "They're great for the cold steel," somebody who was evidently quite in the dark said for the benefit of them all. "That's why they thought the park murderers of Invincibles was done by foreigners, on account of them using knives." At this remark, passed obviously in the spirit of where ignorance is bliss, Mr. Bloom and Stephen, each in his own particular way, both instinctively exchanged meaning glances, in a religious silence of the strictly entre nous variety. However, towards where the Skin the Goat, alias the keeper, was drawing spurts of liquid from his boiler of fare. His inscrutable face, which was really a work of art, a perfect study in itself, beggaring description, conveyed the impression that he didn't understand one jot of what was going on. Funny, very. There ensued a somewhat lengthy pause. One man was reading in fits and starts a stained-by-coffee evening journal. Another, a card with the native shows a day. Another, the seaman's discharge. Mr. Bloom, so far as he was personally concerned, was just pondering in pensive mood. He vividly recollected when the occurrence alluded to took place as well as yesterday, some score of years previously, in the days of the land troubles when it took the civilized world by storm, figuratively speaking. Early in the 80s, 81 to be correct, when he was just turned 15. "Hey, boss," the sailor broke in, "give us them papers." The request being compiled with, he clawed them up with a scrape. Have you seen the Rock of Gibraltar?" Mr. Bloom inquired. The sailor grimaced, chewing in a way that might be read as aye, yes, or no. "Have you touched there too?" Mr. Bloom said. "Europa Point?" Thinking he had, in the hopes that the rover might possibly buy some reminiscences, but he failed to do so, simply letting spurt a jet of spew into the sawdust, and shook his head with a sort of lazy scorn. "What year would that be about?" Mr. Bloom interpolated. "Can you recall the boats?" Our soi-disant sailor munched heavily a while, hungrily, before answering. "I'm tired of all them rocks in the sea," he said, "and boats and ships, salt junk all the time." Tired seemingly, he ceased. His questioner, perceiving that he was not likely to get a great deal of change out of such a wildly old customer, fell to wool-gathering on the enormous dimensions of the water about the globe. Suffices to say that as a casual glance at the map revealed, it covered fully 3/4 of it, and he fully realized accordingly what it meant to rule the waves. On more than one occasion, a dozen at the lowest, near the North Bull at Dollymount, he remarked a superannuated old salt, evidently derelict, seated habitually near the not particularly redolent sea on the wall, staring quite obliviously at it, and it at him, dreaming of fresh woods and pastures, new as someone somewhere sings. And it left him wondering why. Possibly he had tried to find out the secret for himself, flundering up and down the Antipodes and all that sort of thing, and over and under, well, not exactly under, tempting the fates. And the odds were 20-0. There was really no secret about it at all. Nevertheless, without getting into the minutiae of the business, the eloquent fact remained that the sea was there in all of its glory, and in the natural course of things, somebody or other had to sail on it and fly in the face of Providence, though it merely went to show how people usually contrived to load that sort of onus on the other fellow, like the hell idea and the lottery and insurance, which run on identically the same lines, so that for the very reason, if no other, Lifeboat Sunday was a highly laudable institution to which the public at large, no matter where living inland or seaside as the case might be, having it brought home to them like that, should extend its gratitude also to the harbour masters and Coast Guard service, who had to man the rigging and push off out amid the elements, whatever the season, when duty called, Ireland expects that every man, and so on, and sometimes had a terrible time of it. In the wintertime, not forgetting the Irish lights, Kish, and others liable to capsize at any moment, rounding which he once, with his daughter, had experienced some remarkably choppy, not to say stormy weather. "There was this fella sailed with me in the Rover," the old sea dog, himself a rover, proceeded. "Went ashore and took a soft job as a gentleman's valet. A £6 a month. Them are his trousers I've on me now. And he gave me an oilskin and a jackknife. I'm game for that job, shaving and brush up. I hate roaming about. There's my son now, Danny, run off to sea, and his mother got him a draper's in Cork, where he could be drawing easy money." "What age was he?" queried one hero, who, by the way, seen from the side, bore a distant resemblance to Henry Campbell, the town clerk, away from the carking cares of office, unwashed, of course, and in a seedy get-up, a strong suspicion of nose paint about the nasal appendage. "Why," the sailor answered with a slow, puzzled utterance, "my son Danny, he'd be about 18 now, way I figure it." The skibbering father hereupon tore open his grey or unclean anyhow shirt with his 2 hands and scratched away at his chest, on which was to be seen an image tattooed in blue Chinese ink, intended to represent an anchor. "There was lice in the bunk in Bridgewater," he remarked. "Sure as nuts. I must get washed tomorrow or next day. It's them black lads I objects to. I hate those buggers. Suck your blood dry, they does." Seeing they were all looking at his chest, he accommodatingly dragged his shirt more open, so that on top of the time-honored symbol of the mariner's hope and rest, they had a full view of the figure 16 and a young man's side face, looking frowningly rather. "Tattoo," the exhibitor explained. "That was done when we were lying becalmed off Edessa in the Black Sea, under Captain Dalton. Fella the name of Antonia done that. There he is himself, a Greek." "Did it hurt much?" one asked the sailor. That worthy, however, was busily engaged in collecting round the someway in his squeezing, or, "See here," he said, showing Antonia. "There he is, cursing the mate. And there he is now," he added, the same fellow pulling the skin with his fingers. Some special knack, evidently, and he laughing at a yarn. And in point of fact, the young man named Antonio's livid face did actually look like forced smiling. And the curious effect excited the unreserved admiration of everybody, including Skin the Goat, who this time stretched over. And that's it from Ottawa, St. Brigid's Centre. Thank you very much. August Lawn.